My boss slammed his fist on the desk and sneered, "Michael, if you walk out for your mother's funeral, don't bother coming back. You're finished." His words sliced deeper than the news I had just heard. My mother was gone. My chest burned with grief, but Richard Kane, the man I had served loyally for 10 years, reduced my loss to a disposable inconvenience. At 9 Aukha, I was a son mourning his mother. At 9:15, I was a pawn in a $3 million game. I hung up the phone, straightened my tie, and walked into the boardroom to speak 7 words that would change everything. The projector hummed softly in the conference room as I rehearsed my slides for the Singapore client. Every number, every projection, every contingency plan. 10 years of my career felt as if it had been building toward this moment. My tie was straight, my notes crisp. Then the phone rang. "Michael," my wife's voice cracked on the other end. "She's gone. Your mother passed this morning." The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. My knees weakened, as if gravity had doubled. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. Behind me, charts of profit margins and market shares glowed on the wall, meaningless under the weight of those 3 words. My wife sobbed through the line, her grief heavy and raw. From the hallway, I heard the shuffle of sneakers. My 12-year-old son. He saw my face, pale and broken, and whispered, "Dad, when people die, do they hurt?" I couldn't answer. My throat locked, my eyes blurred. I wanted to collapse, to scream, to be with my family, but the phone lit up again, vibrating with a number I knew too well. Richard Kane. My boss. I forced myself to pick it up, my voice trembling. "Michael," Richard barked. Not even a pause, not even a whisper of sympathy. "The Singapore client lands at 11. If you're not in that boardroom, don't bother coming back to this company. A $3 million deal hangs in the balance. Miss it, and you're finished." I froze. My mother's funeral, or my job. My blood roared in my ears. My son stared at me, wide-eyed, waiting for me to choose. My wife's sobs still echoed from the other call. Richard's tone was sharp, impatient, like he was already holding the shovel to bury my career. I said nothing. "Michael," he snapped, "are you hearing me? This company gave you everything. You will not throw it away for a corpse." My grip tightened on the phone until my hand shook. My palm grew damp with sweat. My fingernails dug into my skin. Pain seared through my hand, and I realized I was clenching so hard that blood pricked from my skin. I wanted to shout, to curse him, to tell him he was a monster. But I swallowed it down. A storm raged inside me, but I knew one thing. Richard Kane would never see me beg. I hung up without another word. The silence afterward was suffocating. My wife stood in the doorway, her eyes swollen. My son leaned against her, whispering, "Is Dad still going to the funeral?" His question ripped me open in ways even Richard's cruelty couldn't. I crouched to him, my hands trembling as I touched his shoulder. "I will be there," I whispered, though even I didn't believe my own promise. I stepped into the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection. A man caught between blood and business. A son grieving and an employee shackled. Tears burned in my eyes, but I wiped them away with the same hands that still carried traces of blood from gripping the phone too tightly. How many of you out there have had to bury your tears just to keep a paycheck? To pretend you're unbreakable while the world inside you collapses? I straightened my tie. My body moved on autopilot, but my mind screamed. Every step toward that boardroom felt like a betrayal. To my mother, to my son, to myself. Yet every step away meant Richard's shadow would crush me forever. The hallways blurred as I walked. Faces of coworkers passed by, offering polite nods, unaware that my world had shattered less than an hour ago. My chest heaved as if every breath scraped against broken glass. When I pushed open the boardroom doors, the chatter fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned to me. The loyal workhorse. The man who always delivered. None of them knew my mother lay lifeless, waiting for me. None of them knew the ultimatum that had just been hurled like a knife at my throat. Richard sat at the head of the table, smug, confident, tapping his pen like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. "Michael," he said, voice dripping with disdain, "I trust you've made the right decision." I walked to the center of the room. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the storm I was holding inside. My eyes met his, and for the first time, I didn't look away. The pain was still raw, my grief still choking me, but behind it, something colder began to form, a clarity I had never felt before. The projector flickered to life. Charts lit the wall behind me. My pulse thundered. Every man and woman in that room leaned forward, expecting me to stumble, to crumble. But I didn't. I opened my mouth. My voice, low but steady, cut through the air. 7 words, and the room froze. The silence after my 7 words was suffocating. Faces around the table shifted, uncertain whether to applaud me or condemn me. Richard's eyes narrowed, lips curling into the kind of smirk that carried more threat than any raised voice. "Don't think you're smarter than me, Michael," he said, his pen tapping the polished wood in slow, deliberate beats. That voice, sharp and cold, dragged me backward into a memory I had tried to bury. I was 15, standing outside a shabby office where my mother had just been told her pension, 30 years of labor at a textile mill, was gone. The manager, slick hair and a cheap suit, told her with the same contempt Richard used now. "Bad investments. Nothing left for you." I had watched my mother's face crumble. She never recovered fully from that betrayal, and she worked herself sick just to keep me in school. Now, sitting across from Richard Kane, I saw the same predator in a more expensive suit. My grief collided with fury. History wasn't repeating. It was mocking me. I felt guilt coil in my chest like barbed wire. I had built my career, serving men just like the one who had destroyed my mother's life. But the 7 words I had spoken, calm, deliberate, were not just a defiance. They were a signal, a phrase rehearsed in secrecy, a coded message to someone waiting outside this room. No one else knew. Not Richard, not the board, certainly not the Singapore clients, whose sharp eyes flickered with curiosity as though they sensed there was more beneath the surface. Richard leaned back, smirking, and whispered so only I could hear, "You think you've outplayed me. But you'll crawl back, begging, just like they all do." I met his gaze and said nothing. But inside, my heart pounded with both fear and certainty. The scar my mother carried had become mine, but I would not let Richard carve it deeper. Hours later, I sat in my office, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. My phone buzzed. A message blinked on the screen. "I know what you're doing." My stomach tightened. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I thought Richard had discovered my plan already. Was this a trap? Or was it the ally I'd been hoping for? I stared at the words, my pulse racing, unsure whether to reply. At home that evening, I tried to bury myself in silence. My son crawled onto the couch beside me, his small face searching mine. "Dad," he whispered, "will you be at Grandma's funeral tomorrow?" question crushed me. My throat closed up. I couldn't promise him anything, not while Richard's shadow loomed so large. I looked away, and in that silence, my son understood more than I wanted him to. His head dropped against my shoulder, heavy with disappointment. Later, while my wife prepared the memorial clothes, I sat alone at the dining table, with my laptop glowing faintly. I dug into the Singapore client's background, scrolling through archives and business journals. And there it was, a headline buried 10 years back. Local, teacher honored for saving foreign student. The photo showed a younger version of my mother, arm around a boy in a school uniform. The boy's name, Daniel Ong. Now grown, he was the executive leading the Singapore delegation. My chest tightened. The world spun. My mother's kindness had crossed oceans, and fate had placed her student in the one position that could alter my life. But should I tell him? If I revealed the connection, it might look manipulative, risking the entire deal. If I kept silent, I'd bury the truth of my mother's legacy under Richard's greed. I wrestled with it until my hands trembled. Tell or hide, honor or survive. Near midnight, my inbox pinged. A new message with no sender name, no signature, just an attachment. My finger hovered before I clicked. The file opened to a spreadsheet filled with numbers, transactions, accounts offshore. Each one marked with initials I knew too well. R.K. Richard Kane. Evidence of fraud. Evidence strong enough to burn him to the ground. I leaned back, breath ragged. The shadows in my dining room stretched long across the floor. Whoever sent this knew my battle, but ally or trap, I couldn't yet tell. The choice before me had just multiplied. Funeral, career, truth, revenge. Each path carried a cost. Each path carried blood. And Richard's laugh still echoed in my head. Don't think you're smarter than me. The church smelled faintly of lilies and old wood. My mother's coffin rested at the front, draped in white cloth, the candles flickering as if they too mourned. I stood at the pulpit, my suit pressed, but my soul unraveling, and tried to steady my voice. My mother, I began, staring at the photo propped beside the casket, taught me that integrity is worth more than gold. She believed kindness was a currency that never devalued, even when the world tried to strip her of everything. My throat thickened. The faces before me blurred through tears. Family, neighbors, old friends. I kept speaking, weaving stories of her sacrifices, how she had stitched clothes at midnight, how she had skipped meals so I could eat. Each word was both a eulogy and a wound reopening. What no one knew was that a recorder in my pocket captured every syllable. And when I ended with, "Her legacy is not buried here. It lives in the choices I make," I pressed stop. That file, encrypted and waiting, was sent straight to the inbox of Daniel Ong, the Singapore executive my mother had once saved. Later that day, while mourners placed flowers on her coffin, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A simple message appeared. "We will only proceed if you lead the project." My chest tightened. It was both vindication and a new burden. Richard still strutted around, convinced I was broken, a man ready to collapse. He didn't know the tide had already shifted. I knelt by my mother's coffin, tracing the edge of the frame holding her picture. My lips barely moved as I whispered, "I'll do both, Mom. I'll bury you with dignity, and I'll bury him too." Back at the office, I slipped into the shadows of my cubicle, pulling up files Richard never thought I'd see. His arrogance had always been his blind spot. Months of overlooked emails, receipts with names altered, accounts offshore. Slowly, I built a web where every thread led back to him. The anonymous messages that had started coming grew more precise, guiding me toward folders I never knew existed. Bank statements, shell companies, transfers under shell charities. Someone else wanted Richard gone as much as I did. But the facade of strength I carried cracked late one night. Alone in my office, the building humming with empty silence, I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. It was the first time since her death that I allowed myself to be just a son. Not an employee, not a strategist. Just a son who would never again hear his mother's laugh. My tears blurred the spreadsheets glowing on the screen, numbers swimming into nonsense. The grief pressed against my chest until it hurt to breathe. And in that rawness, I wondered, was I fighting Richard for justice, or simply to avenge the scar he had ripped open in me? The knock on my door startled me. It was Thomas, an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. Once exiled from the firm after crossing Richard, he stepped inside quietly, closing the door. "I know what you're doing," he said softly, "and I want in." I studied his face, searching for betrayal, but in his eyes was something I hadn't seen in a long time: resolve. He placed a flash drive on my desk. Years ago, I kept records. I knew they'd matter someday. It should have been a moment of relief, but shadows lingered, because just as Thomas extended his hand, another email flashed on my screen, this one unsigned, with a single line: "He has eyes in your team." A chill ran down my spine. Richard was not oblivious. He was watching me, perhaps closer than I knew. My office felt suddenly smaller, the walls too tight, the air too thin. The following morning, Richard proved it. In front of the entire board, with the Singapore client seated at the far end, he rose with his signature smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "allow me to expose the coward in our midst." He gestured to me. Michael Turner, the man who abandoned duty for tears, who plays at loyalty but caves under pressure. A pathetic excuse for a leader. A weak, trembling son who can't even choose between his family and his work. The words pierced sharper than knives. Around the table, whispers spread like fire. Daniel Ong's face was unreadable, his hands folded, his gaze steady on me. My hands clenched under the table, every muscle taut. The grief of my mother's funeral still weighed heavy. The anger at Richard burned hotter than ever. But this humiliation, public, deliberate, lit something even deeper. I straightened in my chair, forcing my breath calm. Richard thought he had broken me. He didn't know the storm waiting to be unleashed. The boardroom felt colder than any grave I had ever stood beside. Richard paced at the head of the table, his voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. "I have evidence," he declared, waving a folder high. "Michael Turner has been siphoning funds from this company. Offshore accounts, phantom invoices. It's all here." Gasps rippled through the room. Faces turned to me, some with suspicion, others with pity. My jaw clenched, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than fire. He had twisted the knife, framing me with the very crimes he himself committed. I rose slowly, feeling every eye on me. "If you're going to accuse me," I said evenly, "let's put everything on the table." The projector flickered to life. One by one, I pulled up documents I'd collected. Bank transfers, email chains, secret accounts under Richard's initials. His signature, bold and undeniable, sat on each incriminating page. The silence deepened, but this time it was not suspicion. It was horror. Board members shifted uncomfortably, The Singapore clients leaned forward, their faces hardening. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. This is fabricated, he shouted, slamming his fist against the table. The pen he always tapped rolled off and clattered to the floor. Daniel Ong, calm and deliberate, finally spoke. These documents, cross-reference with records from our side, they are genuine. His gaze cut across the table, not at me, but at Richard. The oxygen seemed to leave the room. Richard's complexion reddened, his chest rising and falling like a cornered animal. He turned on me, his voice cracking under rage. You think you've won, Michael? You think this is over? The board sat frozen. Some couldn't meet my eyes. Others stared at Richard, as if seeing him for the first time. Richard leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and hissed, You've made the mistake of your life. For a moment, I almost believed him. The next morning, the world knew. Headlines screamed, CEO, accused of massive fraud, investors flee. Cameras flashed outside the building. The company's stock plummeted in hours, millions lost. The once untouchable empire began to crack, one headline at a time. Employees whispered in corridors. Some packed their belongings quietly, slipping out like ghosts. Others rallied in groups, demanding answers. The image of Richard's control shattered overnight. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the chaos on my phone. My wife hovered behind me, her hands trembling as she rested them on my shoulders. Michael, she whispered, if they find out you're the one who exposed him, what if they come after us? Her voice shook, her fear heavier than any threat Richard had hurled. I turned, pulling her into my arms. I'll protect you, I said, but the promise felt thin, a paper shield against a storm. Richard did not vanish quietly. Even as the company crumbled, whispers emerged of powerful allies propping him up. Old photographs surfaced, Richard shaking hands with government officials, sharing drinks with figures known for their influence in industries far beyond ours. And then came the realization. Richard wasn't acting alone. He had been a front, a mask for something larger, a network whose reach I hadn't yet measured. The anonymous emails that had once guided me returned, sharper now. One line in particular struck like ice. You've angered the wrong people. I stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the glow of the monitor. The war wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Behind the mask of one man lay an entire structure of greed and power. I had pulled off the first layer. What waited underneath was darker, and it was already watching me. The knock on the door came just after midnight. My wife startled, clutching her robe tighter, while my son peeked from the hallway, eyes wide. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting reporters, half fearing worse. But when the door swung open, there stood Richard Kane. He looked nothing like the man who had once commanded boardrooms with arrogance. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his skin pale with exhaustion. For the first time, Richard looked small. Michael, he rasped, his voice stripped of authority. I need to talk. My wife stepped forward defensively, pulling our son behind her. The boy's face twisted with fear, and he pressed himself against her side. Richard raised his hands. I'm not here to fight, he said. Not anymore. I let him in, though every instinct screamed against it. He sat heavily on the couch, running a hand across his face. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the steady tick of the clock on the wall. You think you've won? Richard muttered, staring at the floor. But you haven't. You exposed me, yes, but you don't understand. I was never the one pulling the strings. My stomach tightened. What are you saying? He looked up, and in his eyes, I saw something I never expected. Fear. I was a puppet, Michael. A pawn for a network bigger than either of us. They built me, propped me up, used me to funnel money and influence. You tore me down, and now they'll need a replacement. They'll come for you. The words landed like a stone. The man who had humiliated me, forced me to choose between my mother's funeral and my career, was now confessing he had been a slave to another master. My son peeked out again, clutching his mother's arm. His innocent eyes locked onto Richard, and I saw him shiver. I felt torn between rage and something dangerously close to pity. You ruined me, I said quietly, each word heavy. You mocked my mother's death. You tried to destroy me, and now you want me to believe you're just another victim? Richard's lips trembled, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a thick envelope from his coat and set it on the coffee table. Inside are names, accounts, contracts, proof of who really controls things. I can't fight them anymore, but maybe you can. My hand hovered over the envelope, hesitant. This was no longer about one corrupt man. It was about an empire built on betrayal. Yet taking it meant stepping into a war I might never escape. Richard stood, his shoulders slumped. Forgive me, or don't. It doesn't matter. But don't think you're safe. They already know your name. As he left, the door clicking shut behind him, the envelope lay like a loaded weapon on the table. My wife whispered, Michael, please, don't open it. But I did. Inside was a web of connections stretching across continents. Corporations, politicians, bankers. Every thread led back to a single syndicate hidden in plain sight. My 7 words in the boardroom had been the spark. But this was the firestorm waiting to ignite. Days later, I met Thomas in a dim cafe far from the office district. He skimmed the documents, his face tightening with each page. We're not alone, he finally said. He tapped a contact name scribbled at the bottom of one sheet. Others have been gathering evidence too. Whistleblowers, fired employees, people ruined by the same machine. There's a network. The revelation hit me like thunder. I thought my fight was singular, born of personal vengeance. But it was bigger, much bigger. That night, I sat with my son, tucking him into bed. His small hand clutched mine. Dad, he whispered, why do you work so hard when it just makes you sad? I swallowed hard, brushing his hair back. Because justice takes time, son. Sometimes longer than we want. But it comes. The truth, though, gnawed at me. Should I rally this hidden network and bring the syndicate to its knees, risking my family's safety? Or should I walk away, accept survival over justice? As I wrestled with the choice, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID was blocked, but the voice on the other end was calm, accented, and official. This is the government of Singapore. Mr. Turner, we need to speak with you. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and hushed meetings behind closed doors. The scandal that had gutted Richard's empire left a vacuum in the industry, and into that vacuum came a small but determined group, survivors. Former employees who had been cast aside, whistleblowers once silenced, people like Thomas who had carried scars from the machine that devoured them. When they asked me to join, I hesitated. After everything, after the nights of staring at the ceiling and wondering if shadowed men were waiting outside my door, the last thing I wanted was another battlefield. But when they explained their vision, A new company built not on greed, but on integrity. I thought of my mother. Her voice echoed in my mind. Kindness is a currency that never devalues. And so I said yes. On my first day, the office was nothing more than rented space in an old brick building downtown. The walls smelled of fresh paint, the desk secondhand. But there was a buzz in the air I hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility, of hope reborn. These people were not polished corporate predators. They were fighters, each carrying wounds, but refusing to surrender. For the first time in a long time, I felt I belonged. The mornings changed too. Instead of rushing out before dawn, tie knotted tight, I lingered in the kitchen. One bright Tuesday, I took my son's hand and walked him to school. The air was crisp, his laughter echoing down the sidewalk as he pointed out birds overhead. At the gate, he hugged me tight. "Dad," he grinned, "this is the first time you weren't late." Something inside me cracked open. For once, I wasn't failing him. Weeks into the new job, during a planning session, the founders unveiled the company's mission statement. I stared at the words projected on the wall. Integrity is worth more than gold. My throat tightened. It was my mother's phrase, the same line I had spoken at her funeral, now immortalized in the DNA of this new venture. Twist of fate, or maybe destiny. Either way, her legacy lived on. But the world has a way of reminding you that peace is never permanent. Late one evening, as I sorted through case files in the new office, my phone buzzed. The caller ID was unfamiliar, international. I hesitated, then answered. A clipped voice spoke, calm and deliberate. "Mr. Turner, this is Meridian Holdings. We'd like you to conduct an internal investigation for us. There are irregularities we cannot ignore." I froze. Meridian Holdings was a giant, one of the most powerful conglomerates in the world. If they were calling me, it meant one of two things. Either they truly sought reform, or I was being drawn into another web. The line clicked dead before I could respond. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The fight I thought I'd finished was calling me again, and it terrified me how much of me wanted to answer. Richard's empire collapsed within months. His name vanished from the news cycle, his assets frozen, his allies scattering like rats. Some said he fled overseas. Others claimed he had been silenced by the very network he once served. Whatever the truth, he was gone. But his ghost lingered. On my son's birthday, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by balloons and laughter. For the first time, I wasn't checking my phone between candles and gifts. I was there, fully present, watching his eyes sparkle as he blew out 12 flames. My wife squeezed my hand, tears soft in her eyes. "You're here," she whispered, "really here." And yet, as the laughter died down that night, an unease crept back. My email pinged. I expected nothing more than routine correspondence. But the subject line froze me. "Your fight is not over." No sender, no trace, just those 6 words. My chest tightened. I closed the laptop slowly, unwilling to let the shadows intrude on my son's joy. But I knew the war I thought I'd ended had only shifted. The puppet strings reached higher, darker, and someone out there was still watching me. The next morning, I drove out to the cemetery. The grass was damp with dew. The sky washed pale blue. I stood over my mother's grave, her name etched in stone. The earth above her settled, but my grief still raw. I knelt, setting fresh lilies against the granite. My voice cracked as I whispered, "I did both, Mom. I buried you with honor, and I buried him with truth. I carried your words into places you never dreamed, and they're building something new because of you. The wind stirred through the trees, rustling like an answer. I bowed my head, my hand pressed against the cool stone. But as I rose to leave, I couldn't shake the weight of the message. Richard had been only one mask. The true face of the enemy was still hidden, and somewhere, behind polished windows and sealed boardrooms, the real war waited.